All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our 2024 Fall Small Ruminant Backyard Farming Series. My name is Megan Purdue. I am the Ag Agent in Worcester County, Maryland. Also on this call is Dr. John Moyle. He is our Extension Poultry Specialist, but don't let that fool you. He does have some experience with small ruminants and a lot of education with livestock in general. So the topic for today is going to be dairy goats. So we always try to have a fun, catchy title. So this one's Got Milk. Are dairy goats a good fit for your farm? We are a university land grant extension program. So anyone is welcome to join in with our programs. And if you need accommodations, let us know a couple weeks beforehand. We'll try to get something to suit you. And if what we come up with doesn't suit you, let us know, and we'll try to figure something else out for that. All right, as always, we do have a lot of disclaimers because these are sensitive topics. When we put something in a presentation, it is not a substitute for your veterinarian. When we're talking about livestock, it is not legal advice. You always need to have your own veterinarian and seek their advice whenever needed and whenever possible. If we do use a website, a product, or a brand, that is not an endorsement. Usually in certain areas of the country, especially here on the Eastern Shore where I'm at, we are very limited to what we have available. So sometimes my examples is just what I have available here. And my philosophy is you use what works for you. There's a lot of different options, but you use what works for you, what is available. And that is what's available in your area, easy for you to get your hands on, cost effective, and does what you need it to for your animals. And as always, I always recommend that you have a veterinarian that you are in good standing with, that comes to your farm or sees your animals at least on an annual basis, so that you are a current client for them. Because if you have an emergency, your options are going to be even more limited if you do not have your own veterinarian. All right, so since we're talking about dairy goats, we're talking specifically more so about does. So anytime you get into something, you want to know what your goals are. So what are your goals when you're considering dairy goats? Is it just so you have milk for your family, so that you know where your milk's coming from? A decent dairy goat's going to produce, if you're feeding it correctly and it's got decent genetics, even without pushing it, you're going to figure on at peak lactation, you're going to figure around a gallon a day, sometimes down to a half, depending on the breed, but anywhere from a half to 1 gallon a day. And that's usually without pushing them too hard. And then their advantage over cows is they require a lot less space. I mean, you have even a full size dairy goat, you're talking about 150 pounds on the heavier side, versus a 1,500 pound cow as larger cows. And then the smaller dairy cows right around 1,000 pounds. So that's a big difference. They're not as hard on the ground. If you have soft ground, um, they can eat stuff right down to the ground, but as far as tearing up ground, they're not going to be as big of a problem as a cow. And then easier for you to handle. Most people can handle a goat by themselves. Versus if your cow decides to be ornery, hopefully you have a good fence and some equipment to get it under control. They are popular as pets. So that might be somebody's motivation, is they just want a goat and they want a pet. So dairy goats are a great option for that because they tend to be friendlier breeds. Or 4-H. It's a popular starter project for most 4-H kids that they can do from 8 years old all the way to 18. Especially smaller youth, it's less intimidating. They might not be any nicer than a cow, but it's less intimidating when you're looking eyeball to eyeball with the animal versus it's way over your head. And again, anybody in the family, most adults in the family will be able to handle a goat, an average goat, even if it decides to act up. Sometimes if you have a farming operation, you have livestock, you might want to stockpile milk. If you have sheep, you might want to add in dairy goats so that you can stockpile milk in the freezer when you have bottle babies, or if you have a meat goat operation, maybe you want to stockpile milk. Most animals can drink goat milk, so a lot of people like to freeze it and use it in emergencies. And you also might want to use them to crossbreed with your meat goats, so you have increased production on your replacement does. So you cross them maybe with a boar, cross a Nubian with a boar, you still retain those looks, but then those crossbred does might have faster growing kids because mom is producing more milk than her 100% boar counterparts. Some of these does can raise larger litters because of that increased milk production as well. So we're going to talk briefly about some of the main dairy breeds of dairy goats. When somebody asks me, "Oh, I want to get dairy goats, what do I get?" I'm going to ask them, "Well, what do you want?" Because there's many different options, and they all have different personalities. I had a niece who very much loved dairy goats, but she did not get along with Alpines. And then I know people that don't get along with Nubians. So they all have different personalities. It's important to explore that before you get into dairy goats because these are friendlier animals. You're going to be working more closely with them usually than a meat animal. So you want to make sure that your personalities match up. Otherwise, it's not going to be fun for any of you. So we're going to start with the small ones because they are very popular because of their size. The Nigerian dwarf is a dairy goat. It's a miniature dairy goat. They can come in almost any color. So the colors there's multiple different colors. It's not the same color for every goat like the Oberhasli we'll talk about later. They have erect ears. Again, they're popular for pet breeds because of their size. And you can cross them with other dairy breeds to produce smaller goats. So that's getting very popular. I see a lot of crosses with Nubians, a lot of crosses with La Manchas. You're going to lose that breed character for the other breed, but it gives you more of a mid-sized goat. For some people, that small size is going to make it harder for them to work with because you're having to bend over to do a lot. And don't let that small size fool you. Most of the goats that I hear about jumping 5-foot fences are Nigerian dwarfs. And I watched a Nigerian dwarf do it. It blew my mind how she just bounced right over that fence like it was nothing. So take that into consideration as well. We're kind of moving up in size. So the Oberhasli would be the next one that I'd take a look at. Oberhaslis are what some people would call more of a boring breed because they're very limited in their coloring. So most of the ones you see are going to be just like that picture. They're going to be that deep reddish brown with black markings. The shades of brown might vary. Occasionally you could get an all black one, which is something different for that breed. They have erect ears. They're a smaller standard size goat is how I would describe them. Again, almost no variation in their markings. Not necessarily going to be a good choice if you want to cross them with a meat breed. I do know people who have done it, but in my opinion, I definitely wouldn't do it with a first freshener and it would be risky. Another breed is going to be the Toggenburg. This for me was an older breed, probably one of the first dairy goat breeds that my family ever had. Again, very similar in coloring. That standard color is going to vary a little bit. Like, your printer ink might be off in its shades. So a brown to gray in color. They have the classic Swiss markings with the white stripes down the sides of the face and the frosted ears. But again, not a lot of color variation. They're a breed that has erect ears. They're a larger standard breed. And being able to find them is going to depend on where you are. So in my area, there's no possibility of finding these. I know one 4-H family that had one for 2 years. That's the only ones that I know of in my immediate area. We have to travel at least 2 to 3 hours to find them. There might be somebody that picked one up at an auction, but they're not a common breed in my area at all. And the next one would be the Saanen. It's an all-white goat. They're not supposed to have non-white markings. That's considered a fault. There are colored Saanens, but they consider those sables. They have erect ears. They're a large breed and very high production. So when I was learning the goat breeds years ago, they compared the Saanen to the Holsteins of the dairy cattle. They produce large quantities of milk, but not known for their high butter fat. The Alpine would be another large standard breed with erect ears. These come in a variety of colors. So for me, the classic Alpine color is the one that's shown, but they come in a lot of different variations of colors, much like the Nigerian dwarf. The La Mancha is a very unique one, and actually the breed was developed in the United States, but their major characteristic is going to be that lack of external ears. So the picture you see is the desired ear, which is a gopher ear, which is very small. There's also the elf ear, which is actually the goat that's in the corner of every slide. She is a La Mancha Nubian mix. She has what's called elf ears. So they kind of look like an upside down elf shoe. So most people look at them and they think that we chopped their ears off, or that one person explained to their child that the ears will grow. And I'm like, I hope my ears don't grow that much faster than my face does. So then you have to explain to them that no, that is a breed characteristic. That is how they are born. That's what they're supposed to look like. They come in any color, any different color. I would call them more of a smaller standard breed, not quite as small as like an Overhausley usually. Different lines are going to be larger, but some, especially some of the older lines, seem to be small, a small, what I call smaller standard breed, but still a standard size dairy goat. And then probably the classic dairy goat that a lot of people think of is the Nubian. So they're very unique with their long pendulous ears. Those ears should be pretty large and it should be longer than the muzzle, especially when you see kids. A breeder explained it to me that the end of the ear should wrap around their muzzle. Then you know their ears are long enough. They can be any color and they should have a Roman nose. They're popular cross with the boar goats because they have some of the same breed characteristics. So you're still getting the pendulous ears, you're still getting the Roman nose. But one of the downfalls with them is they are loud. So people do not like them because they're loud and dramatic. Sometimes it sounds like something bad is going on in the barnyard and it's a Nubian waiting to be fed or wanting attention or just because she sees you out there. So that is a downside to them for many people is their mouth. And then you can have mixed breed dairy goats. You can like the Nigerian dwarf with a standard size to get like a mid-sized goat. If there's a characteristic that you were looking for, you can mix them. The problem is when you do mix them, they are going to lose their breed character. You can still register a mixed breed dairy doe with the American Dairy Goat Association, but she'll be considered a grade doe. And usually you're not going to see, you're going to lose a lot of breed characteristics, especially you get into mixing Nubians with other breeds. You're going to get more of like an airplane ear, not really erect, not pendulous. But if you're looking for just a home milker, these might cost less than a purebred registered doe for you if all you're looking for is to produce milk or if you're looking for a pet. All right, so where does the milk come from? And sometimes we take these things for granted. I know I take it for granted a lot when we're working with poultry, that not everybody knows how, why a chicken lays eggs. So what happens, and you hear some of these terms thrown out with dairy goat people, and you're like, what in the world does that mean? So one term that you're going to hear quite a bit when you're talking dairy goats is, has she freshened? Freshening. So when a goat gives birth, we say that she freshens and she goes into milk. And then there's a drying off period that refers to letting the doe stop producing milk, because usually we're not going to make her produce milk 365 days a year. Usually you want to give her, even the ones with longer lactations, you want to give them a rest period before they have kids and start producing milk again. So we refer to as drying off. Does usually they're going to produce milk until their kids are weaned, and you can keep them producing milk if you milk them afterwards. So they'll produce their milk and then you can start milking them. So there's different management styles we'll talk about later. But if you continue milking them after their kids are weaned, if they're raising the kids themselves, usually you're going to dry them up about 1 to 2 months before she kids again. Give her body some rest, let her gain some nutrition, and then she'll start back that lactation cycle again. Milk production is going to be based on genetics and nutrition, but there's also a supply and demand concept. So if, for example, if you're letting the kids nurse, as the kids get older and they're eating other stuff, they're going to be nursing less. Her milk production is going to go down. If you are not milking twice a day, your goat's milk production is going to go down because there's no demand for it. And then there are some does, some certain lines of different breeds that can go through an extended lactation where they're not necessarily rebred annually, but they continue to be milked. What happens with a lot of people, they try to extend that lactation so they don't have, because they're not interested necessarily in producing kids, but the problem is they're using the wrong type of doe to do that. The genetics of the does they're trying to do that with don't work. So they're putting a lot of effort into a very small amount of milk. But there are certain lines that do that very well. Some dairies will use them because, again, a dairy is not going to be interested necessarily in a bunch of kids. They want their replacement does, but they're more interested in the milk. So they'll use some lines that do well with extended lactation. So nutrition is a very, very important part of milk production. Doe and Milk is working hard. These two does were first fresheners in the picture, same age, same sire, different mothers because they're different breeds. But you can see there's also they're eating the same amount, but one doe is visibly thinner than the other doe. But a doe in milk is working hard. There's a high nutrient requirement for her at that time. You need to make sure you're feeding a balanced ration and giving her what she needs. She's going to need a lot more feed than she would need when she's dry. You want the hay to be high quality, and you want that feed to be balanced for a doe in milk. You want to monitor those body condition scores. So if a goat's dairy goats should be thin compared to meat goats. And I put that in quotes because what I see is a lot of people bringing out an emaciated goat that's literally skin over bones. And when someone says something about it being too skinny, they're like, well, it's a dairy goat. Well, dairy goats can be skinnier. They're going to show bone, but they should not be emaciated, even if they're in high milk production. Now, a very good dairy goat is going to milk the flesh off of her because that's what her genetics tell her to do. So that's where we come in and make sure that we are giving her enough feed to compensate for that. If you are ever in doubt, get an opinion from someone who is experienced. Don't let your animal get emaciated. Now, in my area, a lot of these emaciated does is because they're also, their animals also have a high worm load, a high parasite load, which is also causing them to become thin. So they're fighting two things. They're working hard to produce the milk, but they're also fighting these parasites that are taking nutrition from them, because our peak milk production times are usually peak parasite times as well. So that is something that you need to keep in mind, especially if your animals are out on pastures. So I grew up in the time before meat goats came to the US. I remember a time before meat goats came to the US. I didn't really get into goats until after the Boer goat was here, but I remember a time when my family had goats before 1993. So it always baffled me when people say I can't have a dairy goat because I don't want to milk it. Well, when I was a really young kid, that's all we had was dairy goats, because that's all that existed in this area was just dairy goats. We had Toggenburgs and Nubians, were a lot of the things that were around at that time, and we raised them much like you would raise meat goats. I don't ever remember going out there and milking goats until I was an adult and raising milk goats, because I wanted to. So that's one of the things that people say, I can't have a dairy goat because I don't want to milk it. So do they have to be milked after kidding? That depends on your management. Your management is very important in determining that. Now, you shouldn't really raise any goats unless you're willing to go out there and milk if you have to. Because there's going to be instances, no matter whether you're raising dairy goats or meat goats, where you're going to have to milk a goat at some point. So you must be willing to do that. But your management can determine how hands-on you are with the milking. So dairy does can raise their kids. They can. Sometimes it can go bad, because kids can damage their udder and their teeth specifically. You're going to find certain goats that the kids, once they start getting aggressive and start aggressively nursing, some kids will have very sharp teeth that can cut the back of the udder. And that's something that you need to watch out for. They can also be aggressive to the udder. They can damage the udder, which is why dairy goat producers who also show their goats won't let the kids touch the udder, because they can do damage to it. And then because they have a high milk producing potential, after the kids are weaned, you might have to start milking that goat at least once a day if her milk production is still high. If you don't do that, then you're going to end up with risking damage in the udder, having blown teeth, etc. So those are things that you need to keep in mind, especially when raising does with that high production potential. Relief milking is something that is usually necessary at some point, especially right after kidding, when they already have a lot of edema and that udder's swollen. You may have to relief milk them so that they're comfortable enough to allow the kids to nurse. That also can happen during the weaning process as well, where you have to relief milk. So the different management styles, probably the one most of us are familiar with, is bottle-fed kids. So the kids are removed at birth. That one benefit to that is it's easy to store your excess colostrum, because your dairy goats are going to be producing more colostrum than meat goats would typically. So if you have a doe that has produced a lot of colostrum, usually it's not going to happen with a first freshener, maybe not even a second freshener if she's a 2-year-old. But usually as your does get older, they're going to be producing more quality colostrum and more quantity of it. So those, middle-aged does might be the ones that you want to store that excess colostrum from if you have a doe that freshens without without colostrum, or if you're raising meat goats as well, and you have that need for colostrum, or sometimes you have a doe that has multiples and doesn't have enough for them, and you need to get that excess colostrum to make up for it. And this type of management style, the does are milked twice a day. It is good for biosecurity, specifically CAE, which can affect milk production, is something that we tend to monitor on dairy goat operations. So if you are practicing biosecurity with your bottle kids, typically the milk is going to be pasteurized before feeding it to the kids. That way, if a doe happens to be positive, you kill the CAE by pasteurizing it. You're not passing it on to the kids. This prevents damage to the udder. It can maximize your milking potential because you are milking out that entire udder. So you're creating the demand. And then another advantage to this is you can sell the kids as bottle babies. And a lot of people will go ahead and sell the kids as, sometimes anywhere from a wet bottle kid that's just had colostrum for a couple of days and is on regular milk, to like a 3-week-old and on up. And some of that depends on whether or not you're disbudding them. We'll talk a little bit about that later. You want to make sure they're off to a good start and have recovered from any management things that you have done to them, like a castration, disbudding, vaccinations, tattooing, before you move them on to a new home. Another management style would be dam raised kids. So in this situation, it's like meat goats, the kids are left on the dam. You get fast kid growth because she's likely producing a lot of milk. Then you could also do a kid share. I know some people who have done kid share, like a calf share, where they milk the excess for themselves, or as the kids get older, they might remove the kids for a set amount of time, like overnight or during the day, milk the doe, and then put the kids back in with the doe and let them nurse as they want to. In either situation, after weaning, the doe may be dried off. The problem with this is there's a potential for damaged udders, like we mentioned before, cut teats, or lopsided udders if the kids don't nurse evenly. Sometimes twins won't nurse evenly. Singles especially don't always nurse evenly. So you may end up with a lopsided udder, which is not going to be desirable, especially if you're going to show. And then if that doe is milking heavy at weaning and you do not milk her, the teats may become blown, like the picture. That is a very badly blown teat, and I can tell you that teat was extremely hard to hand milk. You would not be able to get a machine to milk a teat like that, and then hand milking it. It's like you have to go through several pillows of air to get the milk out. It's extremely difficult. Some kids can nurse that, especially as they get older. Some kids can't nurse it at all, which is another problem with it. So if you have high production dairy goats, you want to be very careful with suddenly weaning and drying off. Another management style, and this is the one personally that I use for some of my does, not all of them. Some of them have straight bottle babies. Some of them I do this, is to milk the does after the kids are weaned. So you let her raise the kids. There's a shorter time commitment to milking her. And then once the kids are weaned, you start milking her once or twice a day, depending on how much milk you need. Then you can utilize that milk for the family. You can freeze the milk for bottle babies later on. There's still going to be the potential for udder damage from those kids nursing, but it's going to be a less risk of blown teats. You may have reduced milk production again because of that supply and demand. By the time she has started to dry off, you may only have to milk her once a day, or that might be all it's worth it to you to milk her once a day. My opinion, if you're only getting like a cup of milk when you're milking, it's not worth it, unless you are desperate for some milk. I would like to see, especially in a good dairy goat, I'd like to see, even if she's towards the end of her lactation cycle, if I'm going to milk her, I want to get at least a good quart to half a gallon. Otherwise it's not worth dragging everything out to milk her. When you select your goats, again, you want to think about what your goals are, because that's important to know right off the bat. Especially, I'm coming from a place where I've worked with a lot of 4-Hers. Sometimes people make selections and they're not clear on what their goals are, and then they find out that what they selected is not going to work for them. So with pets, bottle babies are used to human interaction, so they are good options for pets. They're going to bond with you better if they're still in the bottle when you get them. but they're still going to be friendly, regardless. If they're raised on a bottle, they're still going to be friendly. Now, if they're raised in a big dairy and they're on a lamb bar milking unit, then they might not know people quite as well as a kid that's been getting an individual bottle. Wethers can be used as pets. Wethers a castrated male. Keep in mind they're going to get significantly larger than females. That's going to be especially important with the larger standard breed goats. If you're looking for something tiny, if you get a Nigerian dwarf wether, you might be surprised at how big he gets. You have to feed wethers properly. They're at extreme risk for urinary calculi. And if you have any questions about that, I have a whole fact sheet that we wrote a couple of years ago about that. But feeding is extremely important with wethers because they're not very forgiving if you feed them wrong. And urinary calculi is very dangerous and deadly and very painful for them. A retired female might make a good pet, especially if she's been hand milked quite a bit. Usually the retired females are less expensive than the kids. Some of these kids can be surprisingly expensive. And there's less of a time commitment. So if you don't know if goats are for you or you just want one for a couple of years, retired female's probably going to be 8 years old. You're looking at, anywhere from 2 to 5 years left in her lifespan. So that could be a good option. They're popular as 4-H projects, but again, you have to know that getting into it because there's rules for your shows. And you want to know what all the rules are for any potential shows that you might even consider going to. So we have small county fairs where the rules are a little bit more relaxed because we don't have a lot of competition. But if there's any chance whatsoever that youth is going to go to the state fair, then I want them to select their animals based on going to the state fair. Because the state fair has more rules. There's ownership deadlines with a dairy animal. Some shows require them to have American Dairy Goat Association registration. Some of them you have to own that goat before it freshens the first time. So that's an important thing to know, especially if you're looking at adult goats. If it's already had a kid, then it might not be eligible for your child to show. Usually they're going to have a registered animal has to be registered if it's a youth show, has to be registered in the youth's name. So those are all things that you want to get figured out before you actually buy the animal. So if you register it in your name, it has a kid, now your child can't show it. You want to select does. There are some of your county fairs may have wether classes, but typically in a wether class, you're only going to be able to show it up to a year old. So that's another thing you want to look at. If you do select the wether, they might only be able to show it as a kid, and that's it. Versus a doe, they may be able to show as a kid, a dry yearling, a 2, 3, 4, 5, and up year old. You want to select a breed that the 4-H member is going to enjoy and handle. Again, think about those personalities, the difference in personality and the temperament of the different breeds of animals. Appropriate size. You can get something that's too small just as easy you can get something that's too big. And a smaller size doesn't necessarily make them easier to handle. Now, when age is another thing that you want to keep in mind. The older animals are going to have, I call them goat minutes, kid minutes. You put an 8-year-old in a show ring, that 8-year-old only has a certain amount of time, a certain amount of an attention span. So if they're in a 45-minute show, they might do really well the first 10 minutes, and then you see that their attention start to drift and they start to fade. The same thing happens with the animals too, especially when you're dealing with younger animals. And one thing you might notice is in the championship drive, all of those children have adult animals. They might be yearling or a doe in milk, but the older animals can handle the longer shows better. Same thing with older children can handle the longer shows better. So those are some things to keep in mind. You want to look when you're selecting, you want to look at the dam, the mom, the grandmom, and daughters on both sides. They tell you not to look at the buck so much because they're all ugly. But you definitely want to know what the females look like on each side to make sure they have good structure, good strong udders. Like you want a lot of capacity to udder, but you also want really great attachments as well. You don't want a pendulous udder that looks like it's about to fall off. So you want to see all of that on all the females on both sides when you're selecting. You can also, if your goal is to cross them with meat goats, you want to look at large breeds. In this scenario, typically the maternal breed is going to be the dairy breed. you want to consider the breed characteristics. So if you want to maintain the breed characteristics, you want to try to closely match them up as best as possible. You still want that good body structure because that's going to be passed on to the kids. You still want the good udder. Again, the kids are going to have a hard time nursing blown teats, which is going to make you more bottle babies, which is probably not going to be your goal if you're crossing with meat goats. Or if they have that really pendulous udder that doesn't have good attachment and it starts dragging the ground, those udders sag too low. It's really difficult for the kids to nurse. And then before you do this, you got to consider, are you willing to relief milk? If not, you want to look at does with less milk production potential. Maybe you want to start with a dairy cross already and not a purebred dairy goat. One opportunity for this would be the doe culls from show herds. When people do a lot of heavy showing, they're typically trying to keep their numbers still manageable, which means their older goats have to move on to make way for the younger goats that have the improved genetics. If you're looking at a home milker, you want to consider how much space you have. You're going to need at least enough room for 2 goats. Look at what breeds are available in your area and also in your price range. So, you might have goats available in your area, but they're way too expensive for you, especially considering you have to get 2. And then what type of personality do you like? So I recommend people check out the different breeds in person and interact with them. Sometimes you can do that if you have a decent sized dairy goat show at your county fairs. That might be a good opportunity to see them in person. You want to select from good stock. You want the good udders and teats. Even if you're not showing and there's no danger of you ever showing, bad teats are extremely hard to milk. That's why we like good teats. And the teat size is important too, especially if you're looking at miniature breeds. If you're hand milking, it hurts to milk a tiny teat. Now first fresheners are always going to be a little bit small, but I had a goat that had tiny teats and I hated to milk her. And it wasn't, sometimes they're hard to get the milker, even a machine milker, to get the right suction to that too. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Make sure it's going to be comfortable for you in your hand. I tend to have a little bit bigger of a hand. So I like good strong teats on them. A good option for you if you're looking for home milkers, again, it's going to be those culled does from show herds. If they're already in milk, that is a great bonus for you because that means you don't have to wait to breed. So you can start, usually they're going to already be trained to a milk stand. And again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with them. They're just constantly improving their genetics with better bucks. So they have to make room. Maybe that doe has been a finished champion. They already have several daughters from her and they just need to make room. When you're looking at udders, you want to ask to see the udders both full and empty. So when a doe first freshens, she has a lot of edema. So you might look at that udder and think, wow, she must produce 2 gallons a day. And when they milk it out, it's a half a gallon. A lot of what you see if they've just had babies is going to be edema. It's just going to be some swelling in there, which makes their udder look huge. That doesn't mean it's all milk in there. Biosecurity is an important topic for dairy goats, especially. We talked about CAE, that stands for caprine arthritis encephalitis. It's a mouthful, so you will usually only hear people refer to it as CAE. The problem with CAE is for dairy goats, it can cause like a chronic mastitis or a hard udder. So that greatly affects their milk production. But other forms of it, it may come through as arthritis, which affects your does and affects their quality of life. And then I think it's more of a rare form. It causes the encephalitis usually in kids. And I think that one is immediately deadly. But I've not heard of very many cases. I think maybe one case I've only ever heard of that. So I don't think that is the most common. Usually you're going to see the hard udder, chronic mastitis issue, or the arthritis form. Another thing that we monitor for is CL, or caseous lymphadenitis. These are abscesses right around where the lymph nodes would be. So if your goat eats a thorny bush, they're going to get a cheek abscess. So don't be alarmed if you see, or if they have a tooth problem, they might get a cheek abscess. These we look at, they're right around where a lymph node would be. You want to treat all abscesses like they could be this, unless you know for sure that they got into something, because it is very easily, it can spread very easily from goat to goat. Another one that people will test for is Johne's disease. That's considered a wasting disease. Usually you see chronic diarrhea with that. Um, the problem with these diseases is they could be in your herd and that your animals not show symptoms for years. That's why they recommend that you routinely test. You can call your veterinarian to test. They'll pull the blood. They can send it to a private laboratory or a state diagnostic lab, like the Maryland Diagnostic Lab does test for this through the Frederick office. But your vet can come out and pull it, or you can learn to pull the blood samples yourself and send them off. You have to make sure you have the right amount for the lab that you're sending them to, and in the correct blood tube, which is usually going to be a red top blood tube because they need whole blood that they spin down. You want to buy from clean herds where all the adult animals are tested. And if you buy animals, you're not sure about their status, you want to quarantine and test 2 new animals, consult with your veterinarian because age does matter when you're testing as well. So you might test a kid and it come up clean. That does not mean it's clean. Usually they want them over 6 months, and you still want to monitor. You want to routinely test. So for milking supplies, when you do start milking, you can milk with very minimal supplies. Milking stand is not necessary, but it makes your life a whole lot easier. Usually these will come with a headpiece that's a stanchion and then a feed pan. A milk pail of some sort, so you need a container that is going to catch your milk. Some people use glass jars. I prefer a stainless steel milk bucket. I like the ones with lids because if you're hand milking or they decide to act up, you can slap the lid on it. You're not going to lose milk. You can put the lid on it in between goats if you're using it for multiple goats. You do need some sort of udder wash. So you can use soap and water. Some people use baby wipes. You can use a commercial udder wash. I just got commercial udder wash for the first time because they started carrying it locally. I think it was a mistake because we only have one dairy in a tri-county area. You do need some sort of treatment after you milk. So a lot of people use the teat spray. Fight Back is a very popular one because you can milk a lot of goats on one can of that. Or you can use a teat dip that you mix up yourself. Disposable gloves, you might need this because your hands are going to need to be clean. So if there's no way to get your animal on the stand and go outside and keep your hands clean, then you might want to use disposable gloves to milk them if you're milking by hand. Machines are expensive, so it might be cost prohibitive, especially if you're only milking a couple of does. The thing I like about machines is they're a closed system, so you're going to keep your milk clean. You're not going to dirt and hair is not going to drop off the udder into the milk. And usually there's some sort of filter on it too, which makes sure that it is extremely clean. If you're using too much vacuum on the machine, then it can damage your teats. Cleaning them can be complicated, and that's extremely important because the last thing you want is for those hoses to collect milk and have bacteria and grow things you don't want it to grow. So cleanliness is very important, and it can be very complicated depending on the machine that you pick. Usually they come in 1 milker versus 2 milkers. So if you have a lot of goats, you might want to go with a 2 milker so you can milk 2 goats at the same time. Goats have to be trained to accept the machine. So if you milk your goat every day by hand and it does perfect, that does not mean that it is going to like it when you hook up all these tubes to them. There's a lot available now. This was just like a fraction of the screenshot when I put it into the Google search. There's a lot of things. They all have pros and cons. Just be very careful of the very cheap options that you see like on Amazon, homemade options, because sometimes those have a direct sucking action. They don't pulsate, and those are more likely to damage teats. The Utterly Easy Milker, that's something that you can use, in a one time, like in an emergency when you got to get milk from a doe, she's not trained, you use something like that, but it's not something I would use on a daily basis. You want to make sure that you're using something that's not going to damage their teats. I would ask for reviews from other breeders who have been using these machines for several years and see how they like them. What are the pros and cons in their opinion? If it's a show farm, most likely whatever they're using is going to be gentle on the teats and not likely to damage them. But you want to look at those reviews. Again, we can't really tell you what you should and shouldn't buy. just do your homework when you're looking for one. When you're training the does to the stand, you always want to make sure that when your doe is on the stand, she is monitored. If she jumps off or she falls off, she can strangle herself. She can flip the stand on top of herself. Even if she doesn't majorly hurt herself or kill herself, she's not probably going to want to get back on there. So you want any experience that they have on the stand to be a good experience. They do not recommend you actually doing any management like trimming hooves or vaccinations or drawing blood while they're on the stand, because it needs to be a positive experience. Now, my does, they don't care as long as there's food in there. They're fine with the stand now that they're trained to it. But keep that in mind when you are training them, that if you do something to them that hurts, even if it's in their best interest, they might not want to get back on there again. You want it to be like trying to it'd be like training your dog to ride in the car, but every time you put it in the car, you take it to the vet. It's not going to like ride in the car anymore. One of the ways you can get them used to that is to feed your kids and yearlings on the stand before they freshen. It's a kind of a monkey see, monkey do thing, because I've noticed that my kids love to get up on the stand because they see all the adults getting on the stand. They will quickly learn that the stand means food, and that's a good thing. I can call my goats now by name. They run to the gate, I let them out, they go straight onto the stand. When the kids are younger, you can let them jump on and off of it, again, with supervision, because, these portable stands can flip. It's not real easy to flip, but they can flip. All right, so when you're milking, you want to know the technique. Hand milking should not be painful for the doe. So don't pinch the teats. I mean, a lot of people will try to strip the teats. That's okay when your doe first has babies. You want to make sure that she's producing milk and get that plug out so the babies can nurse, but that's not how your milk technique should be. Most does are only going to stand still while you're milking them. So once the food runs out, then they're ready to be off the stand. So that means that you got to learn to milk fairly quickly, because you don't want to overfeed the doe and give her diarrhea or a stomach ache. So you're looking at a 5 to 10 minute window usually. You're going to have to build strength in your hands. It might hurt. It might hurt your hands. You might find your hands cramping if you're not used to it. My hands actually I milked a lot of does one summer, and I went on a trip and suddenly stopped milking for a couple of days because somebody was watching my does, and my hands started cramping because I wasn't milking anymore. But I do remember that first dairy doe that I had. It hurt. It's not fun. I know some people with arthritis issues, they have to have a machine because they can't milk them by hand. So this is a good diagram of the technique. It's an old diagram. It's been around for a while, but it shows you the hand placement. You're basically starting at the top of the teat and literally milking, but forcing the milk. You're closing one finger at a time and forcing that milk down through the teat. And what you don't think people are doing, it looks like they're just straight squeezing, but a lot of people that have been doing it for many, many years, they do it very quickly. And if you were to do that in slow motion, take a video and do it in slow motion, you'd see that technique where it's one finger at a time going down the teat. So before you milk, you need to look at your doe. Some does, you really want to shave their udder before you start milking them, because they're very hairy. That hair will drop off into the milk. So you want to do that before you start milking her. So that may need to be done like a week before you start milking. Don't factor that into your feeding time. In other words, you want to make sure you have all the supplies ready to go and located near the stand. Again, you're only going to have a 5 to 10 minute window from the time she gets on that stand to the time she's ready to get off. You want to load the doe onto the stand. You want to have the stand somewhere in an area where there's no other loose animals or kids, because then they're going to try to get in her feed bucket. She's going to be fighting with them instead of eating, and she's going to be bouncing around on the stand, and it's not going to end well for anybody. You want to give her the feed, but only the quantity that she's used to. You don't want to suddenly, even if she's going to need more feed, you don't want to bump her feed up too much too quickly. Again, you're going to give her diarrhea. So if you notice that she needs to be increased, you're going to have to do that on a gradual basis. You want to wash the udder, make sure you get all the dirt and loose hairs off of it, strip the teat, make sure that milk that comes out looks normal. The first squirt is where most of the somatic cells are. You don't necessarily want that into your milk that you're going to be using. Milk her out quickly and as efficiently as possible, especially if she's a fast eater, and then spray or dip the teats with an antibacterial spray or dip. So this is kind of a slow motion pictures of me actually milking a doe that I think it was raining, so I had to milk her in the hay barn instead of on her stand. With difficult does, usually your inexperienced does and your young does might kick. What I found is if you use you got to get her milked out and you got to get her used to it. So, like soda bottles, if you use a small soda bottle, you can hold in one hand while you milk with the other hand, that lessens the likelihood of her kicking it out of your hand, versus trying to leave it on the stand and she kicks it over. You want to handle your does prior to freshening so that they're used to it. That might help you. You don't want the first time that you handle her to be on the stand after she's freshened. Does don't have to be friendly to be good milkers. One of my best milkers didn't like to be touched at all. The only way you could touch her is if you called her out by name and put her on the milk stand. I had a daughter out of her that she raised that was not a bottle baby, extremely flighty. But when it came time for her to be milked, when she freshened, all I had to do was look at her, open the gate, she'd run, get up on the stand, and I could milk her. Could I touch her in the pen? Absolutely not. But I could milk her. They have to learn that good things come from the stand, which is feed and that relief from a full udder. Some things that you would want to consider: if you own a dairy goat, you should at least know how to milk. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to milk all the time, but you should know how to do it if you need to. Regardless of your management style, you're going to have to relief milk at some point. You can take advantage of the excess milk and colostrum and freeze it. Even if you don't use it for most of your bottle babies, you still have that colostrum in case of an emergency. You still have some milk to get a bottle baby started. Maybe because sometimes our emergencies don't happen in the middle of the day when the store's open. Once you start milking, you need to be consistent with it. So every day at the same time or around the same time. And they will know if you're late. They'll let you know if you're late. Choose that management style that fits your lifestyle and that you can maintain. One of the reasons that I did the dam raised and then milk afterwards is because I can milk once a day. I've always worked a full-time job, sometimes 2 jobs. So milking twice a day, every day, just does not fit into my schedule. So that's why I do. It is a risk to damage the udder, but I'm also not. I don't show. I had some 4-Hers who showed years ago, but I'm not big into shows. So if it damages it a little bit, it's not the end of the world for me. Keep your eye on the udder even before they freshen. You want to watch the udder as it begins to develop. Mastitis can occur before the kids are born, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. The picture of this udder was, I was shown a picture of the udder, and I'm like, she looks like that. Is it hot? It was mastitis, and this picture was probably taken a week before this doe kidded. But the owners didn't register with them that she could have mastitis before her kids were born. And she had it pretty heavily on the right side. If there's any abnormalities, you want to immediately examine it. So if you notice she's developing an udder, especially if her udder was not lopsided when she dried off the year before, if it's lopsided, you need to take a look at it. If there's redness, if it's hot or abnormally warm, there's excessive swelling, especially on one side. If there's any cuts to the teats or injuries, you want to note that and you want to examine it, get a call into your vet. You may need to do a mastitis test, or do a culture. Also during this time, if you notice any symptoms of mastitis, you want to monitor the doe's temperature to make sure that does not go systemic, because that does happen. Usually it's contained to the udder, but there are cases where it will go systemic. So you want to keep an eye on the temperature. If your doe develops a fever when she has mastitis symptoms, then you need to call the vet immediately. So mastitis is an infection in the udder. Again, call the veterinarian immediately to begin the appropriate treatment. And they're going to advise you on that. They might want you to collect a sample, or they might need to come out and collect a clean milk sample in a sterile container before you begin any treatment to have a culture done on it. I've done mastitis cultures, and it turned out that the only over-the-counter mastitis treatment the bacteria was resistant to, and the vet had to special order a different type of mastitis treatment. So keep that in mind and alert your vet in case they do want that culture ahead of time, because the culture is going to take a couple of days to come back. Meanwhile, you want to go, they're probably going to have you start mastitis treatment most likely. Treatment typically is going to involve milking the doe out as best you can. If you can get her all the way milked out, that is ideal. Sometimes they won't let you do that because they're so painful. If that is the case, again, call the vet and tell them she's in a lot of pain. They might prescribe some pain meds for them. Usually you're going to have intramammary antibiotics, even if you can't get her milked out all the way. This doe did not get milked out all the way. So they had to put the antibiotic in with the milk still in there. It still works, but it would be better if she were milked out all the way. And then you can use topical treatments as well. They're not going to hurt anything. Topical treatments can be started at the first sign of any abnormality. So if you notice a little bit of blood in the milk or her getting a little bit swollen, even if she's not coming up positive for mastitis, you can start that topical treatment. And that might keep you from having full-blown mastitis. Again, mastitis can become systemic and deadly, especially if they get gangrenous mastitis. There are cases of gangrenous mastitis where part of the udder falls off. There's cases of gangrenous mastitis where the doe dies. So watch your does closely if they've had mastitis or they have mastitis. If they're not improving or showing any sign, or they start showing signs of a fever, you want to notify your veterinarian. All right, now disbudding, that's another controversial topic for a lot of people. Some people are adamantly against it. Dairy goat people tend to be for it. We'll talk about the good part of it is safety. And that's the reason that we do it. We don't do it for aesthetics. We do it for safety of the animals, number one, because you're raising dairy goats. They have these ginormous udders. Those horns can do a lot of damage because goats love to fight. They like to be in close spaces, but then they don't like to be close to each other sometimes. So a horn can do a lot of damage to an udder. A broken horn causes a lot of pain, number one, but it can also be deadly for that animal depending on where it breaks. So Lucy was an older goat of mine. She's long gone, but she is our poster child for why disbudding is okay. Because there was one day Lucy wished she had been disbudded because she picked a fight with another animal. The other animal obviously won. You'll see it's her right horn is broken off. Fortunately for her, it was not broken off at the base, so it left a stump, so it didn't bleed excessively. But I've never seen an animal in so much pain. I could put nothing on that. Anything, even a light piece of gauze caused her extreme pain. We went into the vet. She got some good sedatives, and turns out the rest of the horn just needed a quick pop, and it came off. The rest of the horn came off, and we were able to remove it. But I could not touch her. I couldn't examine her without major pain meds. Fences are also an issue with animals with horns. You can get fences that they cannot get their head through and get stuck. But if you do not have those fences, and do not have electrical in the interior of your fence, then your animals can get their head stuck in there because they can't get back out because the horns stop them. There's also the possibility of injuries to people when you're working very closely with them, especially if you have children who are showing them. Sometimes those horns are at eye level. So people prefer to have disbudded animals, especially dairy goats. Dairy goat horns can be a little wonky, especially when you compare them to boar breeds that have a nice curvature straight back usually. Dairy goat horns can go every which way. So the main reason that we do it is for the safety of the animals themselves so that they don't hurt each other. But also safety to people is another aspect. Now, the bad side of disbudding, which there is a bad side to it, one, they lose a form of protection. So if they are around predatory animals, you have to give them better fences. You have to give them more protection because they've lost some of that protection. Scurs, where the horns grow back a little bit, they're not necessarily attached to the skull. Some of them can be pretty nasty though. Usually you're going to see small scurs in bucks. But I have seen them in does where people didn't exactly know what they were doing when they were disbudding, and there's a learning curve to it. I do a pretty good job disbudding now. I used to be famous for producing unicorn goats, though. Usually my goats on the same side would have one scur. We called them the unicorns. I've gotten better since then, and I don't have the unicorns, but I've seen goats with scurs that grew straight down their face. that looked like a horn that was growing down instead of up. So bad scurs are a downside to disc budding. The disc budding process is unpleasant. Nobody likes to do it. I'm pretty good at it. I'm used to it. I still do not like doing it. The person who taught me how to do it had been doing it for 30 years. She didn't like doing it. When I first started with dairy goats, I had my vet disc bud. She did it. She didn't like it. I don't know anybody that enjoys disc budding kids. It can be dangerous if it's not done properly. So it has to be done when those kids, before the horns actually come through, which is going to be anywhere from a few days to like a week, maybe 2 weeks for some doe kids. But it has to be done before the horn actually pops through, when you're just barely feeling a little nub there. But if you overheat the animal's head, you can literally fry their brain and you can kill them. So you have to keep that in mind. It's not entirely safe. You could also burn yourself. But we're not going to talk about exactly how to do it, but being dangerous is one of the big downsides to it. And then even if it's done properly, there's still the chance that while it's healing, it develops a scab. And usually there's one kid every year that gets playing too rough and knocks their head on something and knocks the scab off before it's ready to fall off. And it can bleed profusely. And it's very ugly. It's a very ugly side of this budding process. It can be hard to get the bleeding under control. It happened to me 2 years ago while a family was visiting the goats that they were going to buy. But I wanted their disc budding to heal a little bit more before I sent them to them. They were playing with the goats. The goats were having a great time. One of them knocks a scab off, starts bleeding. I couldn't do anything for it. I couldn't cauterize it. Cold wasn't working. Finally, I'm like, okay, playtime's over. Put everybody away, let her settle down. Her blood pressure went down. She relaxed and it stopped bleeding. But it is scary. If you've never seen it before, it's very scary. I've seen it before and I don't like it. It still makes me uncomfortable because I don't like anything losing any amount of blood. All right. So in conclusion, while dairy goats can be a time commitment, there are many benefits to owning them. They're entertaining. They're friendly goats. You have a source of fresh milk, either for your family use or if you want to make soap. The frozen milk can be used for orphans. And then if you are crossing, you can get increased milk production on your maternal breeds and get some faster growing kids. As always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me either through email or you can call my office. Most of the time that goes straight now to a voicemail, but voicemail goes to my email. So even if you leave me a voicemail, I'll get it on my email. I can listen to it on my email if I'm out of the office. If you have any other questions, though, right now, you can put those in the chat. I'm going to stop the recording.